So my name's Jeremy. I'm one of the founders of a company called FireTail. We work in the API security space. APIs are something that I think a lot of people use every day. In fact, all of you use them every day. I can 100% guarantee you that. You just don't realize that you're doing it. In fact, right now on the modern internet, 83% of all web requests are actually API calls. So that's not your Google search, my Google search, you pulling up your email or anything like that. That is, in fact, you make a request to a service like Google or like Amazon.com, and that service then pulls in all kinds of other content and functionality from other sources to assemble the thing that gets delivered back to you. That is what APIs are. That is what they do. They're often called kind of the connective tissue of the modern internet. In fact, we'll do a little pop quiz to see how much people know about API calls today. So this is a application diagram of food delivery, mobile food delivery services, things like DoorDash or Uber Eats or Grubhub that I'm sure we've all used. So by a show of hands, how many of you think that there are between 0 and 10 API calls in this one transaction? 0 to 10. 10 to 20? 20 to 30? Above 30? Above 30 is probably right. Now, obviously it will vary from service to service, but I was working with one of the engineers from one of these companies. We got up to about 25 and just a minute or so of looking through this diagram, and he goes, there's easily 10 more, but we stopped counting at that point. And the point is, there's two things I want to call out from this diagram. Number one is that in this whole thing, you'll notice that the place where you live is going to be sent to multiple providers, or the place where you're having the food delivered to. Secondly, you'll notice that the payment processing and tipping is actually done through API services as well. So we have critical personally identifiable information, PII, and we have business critical elements being sent to transact over APIs. So this is the level of data security that we need in looking at APIs. It's become an actual urgent and critical issue. Gartner is predicting that over the next couple of years, APIs will become the #1 attack vector across all different attack surfaces inside organizations. We're approaching about 1 trillion API endpoints on the modern internet. We're maybe like 1 to 2 years away from hitting that. The growth rate is actually compounding year over year as well. We know that more than 60% of developers are regularly incorporating third-party API services into what they're doing. The challenge around APIs is that traditional security measures often don't work. Part of the reason around that, and I'm just going to go quickly through this, is there's been an analysis by an organization called OAuth to look at kind of some of the top threat vectors around APIs, and you'll notice that all of them kind of live inside this server here in this diagram, and they really align to the server logic. And so the challenge is that we're not seeing the same types of traditional attacks that we would have seen with things like malformed packets or things like that. We're now seeing logical attacks against APIs. Our own analysis from the past 10 years of publicly disclosed API-based data breaches leads to one striking conclusion, which is that identity is actually really central to API security. Specifically, you'll notice this is the number of records breached over the past decade analyzed by primary attack vector. Authentication and authorization are #1 and #2. And we don't have time to go through all the details about the specific approaches or the specific ways that these things have been breached, but that is kind of why we are so focused on helping companies solve the authentication authorization challenges around API security. We do this by bridging the gap between application teams and security teams. Why? Because one common thing that we've seen is that security teams are responsible, but application teams actually build the APIs. And when the attacks are happening on the logic side, they need to be fixed by application teams who own those APIs. We have an open source code library that does inline checking of API calls for valid authentication and authorization. We have centralized audit trail. We bring together a lot of the core components of API visibility, observability, and enforcement. If you're interested in learning more, we're just over there on the startup stands. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly click through all of that. One key thing that I will highlight though, on our open source code library that's on GitHub, that's available for any organization who is creating APIs today. Feel free to grab that, download it, use it as you wish, and it will enforce proper checks for authentication and authorization in your APIs. And really our goal is to help make all of the APIs across the internet more secure. With that, I will say thank you very much for your time.